Welcome in to everyone who's joining. I can see the attendees are hopping into the webinar there just as I talk. So I'll wait a moment to make sure that they're all in and we'll get going with introductions then. And we extend a particular welcome to everyone who has the sun shining outside, or maybe you're outside in the sun yourself this evening. Wherever you've chosen to join the webinar from, we are delighted to have you with us. This evening, we are taking a closer look at dyslexia, and this is one of the LAI, Literacy Association of Ireland, spring series of webinars. And I'm delighted to be joined for the webinar this evening by three esteemed panelists with excellent knowledge of the topic that we're looking at. And over the next hour or so, we will explore issues relating to assessment, practice, inclusion for dyslexic learners in the classroom. And obviously, we will welcome questions that relate to home as well if we've any parents or guardians who are joining the webinar this evening. Before we get started, I want to just touch on a few points. So the webinar is being recorded just for your information. We have the question and answer and the chat boxes open. So I will be keeping an eye on both of those over the next hour or so. So please feel free to put in any questions that you have, and we'll do our best to come to them as we move through the different topics that we're going to look at this evening. I want to also extend my thanks to Navan, Clare, and Tralee Education Centres for hosting the webinar this evening, and Aideen in particular. Their support in managing the registration and so on is greatly appreciated, and that thanks is extended on behalf of the Literacy Association of Ireland here this evening. So just a little bit about LAI before we get started. I just want to flag for anyone who's joining and who's not familiar with the Literacy Association of Ireland, we currently have our call for papers up. So if you'd like to present at our annual conference in November, November 7th and 8th, please check out our website. So that's literacyireland.com/conference. Also on the website, you'll find details on how to join Literacy Association of Ireland if you would like to become a member and stay up to date with all of what we're up to. So we look forward to hearing from you if you are interested in joining us or joining us for the conference. But without further ado, I think we'll get going with our focus for this evening. I'm going to stop sharing the slides for a moment and properly introduce our panel. So I'm going to go for in the order that I have them on my screen here. So the first panelist is Dr. Paula Lehan. Paula Lehan is an assistant professor in the School of Inclusive and Special Education here in Dublin City University, and she's also the chair of the IMEd in Specific Learning Difficulties Dyslexia here in GCU. Also joining us here this evening is Dr. Jen O'Sullivan, who is a former president of the Literacy Association of Ireland and a lecturer in literacy education in Marino Institute of Education. And we are also delighted to have joining us Donald Ewing, who's the head of education and policy with Dyslexia Ireland. So over the next little while, we're going to really get into some meaty discussion around dyslexia. But the first question that I have for the panel is, how should we best conceptualize or define or think about dyslexia? So what is dyslexia? What do we need to bear in mind when we're thinking about what dyslexia is? And maybe we'll get into as well what dyslexia is not, if anyone would like to get us started.
Yeah, I don't mind coming in here, Patrick. Evening, everybody. I suppose, despite the fact that there's so much research has been conducted in the area of dyslexia, and despite the multidisciplinary field that has conducted that research, what's quite interesting is the field hasn't really been able to produce a universally accepted definition of dyslexia, which has kind of significant ramifications when we think of it, because if you're coming from different perspectives and looking at different definitions of dyslexia, well, can we be sure that we're assessing the same thing? Can we, and it's one of the reasons why the question around the prevalence of dyslexia, some people are saying it's 5%, some people say it's 20% of the population. And that's really down to this, the lack of a consensus around the definition. Now, I suppose the one we would use most, or a lot of us would know well, is the International Dyslexia Association definition. And I do have a slide there because
Brilliant.
it's a pretty wordy one, so we might just share that. Um, so this is the one that most of us would know quite well. But you can see here it dates back to 2003, so it's over 20 years old. It does talk about dyslexia being a specific learning disability that's neurobiological in origin. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding. The difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component, and we know that there are secondary consequences. Now, because I suppose this definition is quite dated now at this point, and significant research has happened since 2003 in this particular area, there's been quite a lot of renewed interest in terms of revisiting the definitions of dyslexia. If you hop down to not the next slide, Patrick, the one after,
Okay.
I just want to sort of flag some of the interest. There's been quite a few research articles over the last couple of years from very well-known researchers in the field, like Marianne Wolf. We have her one here from 2003 about, looking at a dynamic, comprehensive conceptualization of dyslexia. We have Katz and all his colleagues in the Florida Center for Reading Research looking at revisiting the definition of dyslexia. We have Elliot and Grigonenko's revised dyslexia debate book, which was only just recently published. And then most recently, if we go back one slide, so I'm hopping you all over the place and I'll let the others come in here. We now have the Delphi definition, or the Delphi dyslexia panel, that was put together in order to try to draw upon the research, the most recent research, and to try to arrive at a more universally accepted definition of dyslexia. So I might let some of my other panelists come in and talk. I know, Donald, you're probably looking to get in on the chat on this particular definition.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, I think very much agree with you. I think it's been welcome that there's been an updated definition, particularly the most recent one coming from the UK, just because the rigor behind it. And I've just popped into the chat there our own definition. I think, well, actually, I'm not sure I can actually do that as a panelist, but I'll maybe ask Patrick to pop that.
I'll find it for you, Donald. Yeah.
Thanks. I'll pop it in anyway. You can see it just now. And we put that together. We locked ourselves in a basement of a Dublin hotel quite a few years ago now, probably about 20. It's probably about before the pandemic, 2019, and then we updated it in 2022. And when the Delphi definition came out, it very much chimed with what we had come up with, which was quite confirming for us. And one of the key issues is trying to get away from a one sentence definition, because dyslexia requires a little bit more nuance than that. So the idea of both our definition and the Delphi definition is a series of statements about which very few people disagree, if you like, is maybe the best way to think about it. And I think the other point I just wanted to make is sometimes when people say there's no universal agreed definition, which is true, it's not the same as saying people can't agree what dyslexia is. It's just saying it's sometimes quite hard to pin it down, or has been historically quite hard to pin it down in a way that reflects the research evidence that's most up to date. And the final thing to say is how we assess for dyslexia needs to catch up still, even before Delphi definitions. The way that educational psychologists would assess for dyslexia, probably there's a range of practice, but we definitely need to make sure that what we're doing in terms of assessment mirrors what we currently understand from an academic sense dyslexia is.
Thanks, Donald. Paula, go ahead. Did you want to join in there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that Donald has made. And the Delphi definition is a really positive move forward, because obviously it aligns with most contemporary research, but it kind of broadens out this idea of there not being a single sort of like test for dyslexia, that because there's so many potential reasons why you may see evidence of literacy difficulties leading to dyslexia, that using a really strict cutoff score, that if someone gets this test score on this one test, then they are dyslexic. And what we have now is that while the Delphi study was also continuing onwards, there was new guidance in relation to best practice on assessment. And as Donald said, that guidance should really be what we're focusing on now moving forward if we're going to take this definition of dyslexia, which really acknowledges, that there are cognitive processes beyond phonological processing that we need to be aware of. That is multiple sources of evidence. And if you pop down to the next slide, I think, Patrick, I put some. Oh, apologies, it's not there. I had shared it on the Google Slides, but
Sorry.
in this updated idea, it really focused on this idea that the complexity involved in assessing dyslexia and the need to draw on multiple sources of information. So background factors, if there's any family sources, qualitative observations, and standardized test results, and that you use this professional judgment to actually make a skilled inference about whether there's evidence for dyslexia, that these really harsh cutoff points, this idea, as Donald kind of said, about the discrepancy model where intelligence is assumed to have a really big factor in identifying dyslexia. I think that's a really positive aspect of, the 2024 understanding of dyslexia, that assessment has also moved on as well.
And I might just hop in there. We've been using the term Delphi study, which actually, even to a lot of researchers, that can be an alien term. And correct me now, guys, if I have this wrong, but a Delphi study is basically where they asked many different experts to come together and rate different aspects of what they would view dyslexia as encompassing, to get to the point where they've a relative degree of consensus amongst those different experts about what should be included and what shouldn't be included. And I'm just going to bring in a few comments there from the chat. I know that Suzanne there is mentioning that discrepancy model involving intelligence, intelligence testing and diagnosis still seems to be in use in certain cases, which wouldn't really align at all with the kind of conceptualization or idea of dyslexia that we've just discussed there. David also noting kind of the changes in the language that's in and welcoming the changes in the language that's there. And Trina also, who is obviously all over the Delphi definition already, is welcoming this kind of consensus that's there in the research and with experts on how best to define it. So I'll just note again for maybe anyone who joined late, if you'd like to join in the discussion, feel free to do so in the chat or in the question and answer box. Or put in any questions that you might have. I might actually move on to another kind of related question. So we talked there about what dyslexia is and kind of the consensus that's there, but we are all aware of myths that exist around dyslexia. Sometimes well-intentioned kind of guidance or advice, but stuff that's inaccurate, basically, and that doesn't hold water. Are there any myths in particular that you guys would like to discuss, point out, and kind of relegate to the dustbin this evening around dyslexia?
And maybe kick us off if that's okay. We were actually looking at some slides this afternoon with a series of myths that we're going to be revising for our upcoming teacher courses in the autumn. And there's a lot actually still, which sometimes is a little bit depressing that there is still that sort of lack of up-to-date understanding and knowledge. However, one of the key ones that we're sort of aware of, and it's been in the media and the social media discussions around other conditions like being people who are autistic or ADHD, and that's the idea that it is always, it's definitely good we're moving away from a deficit model, but sometimes we can be a bit too positive about dyslexia, and in the sense of, and that's some of the narratives around superpowers and strengths and gifts. And whilst that's well intentioned, I think a lot of the time, and it's definitely true that many people with dyslexia do have strengths and talents and gifts, it can sometimes drift into a little bit of toxic positivity and can be a bit disheartening for people who are very much struggling in primary or secondary school or in college, and they don't have that entrepreneurial spirit. They don't have that amazing artistic or musical ability. And they find sometimes the profiling of people that do, whether they're movie stars or tech entrepreneurs or just, the local GAA star, they sometimes feel that that can be a little bit galling. So it's important to point out, I think, is to get that balance right. Being dyslexic can sometimes be very, very challenging in terms of the mechanics of reading and spelling, in terms of accessing the curriculum at primary, in terms of passing exams in post-primary. And whilst positives and strengths are important and a profile of strengths and difficulties is important, we just need to get away from that idea that, oh, you're dyslexic, you're very lucky because you're going to be amazing at this, this, or this. And I think sometimes that balance is something that's a bit tricky to try to strike.
Thanks, Donald. Anyone else want to hop in on that one?
I'll come in on the, I suppose, the girls versus boys, and that more boys have dyslexia than girls. I think that is another one that's been pretty much disproven. There's a slight increase in the number of boys as opposed to girls, but it's not in any way statistically significant. So what does happen is boys are often referred more so than girls. And that can be very often because girls can be quite good at masking and a little bit better. Sorry, Donald, at masking, and Patrick, at masking their dyslexia. So I suppose it's just to be aware that, it's almost equivalent, slightly more for boys, but that idea that more boys have dyslexia than girls is another one of those myths that's out there.
Thanks, Jen. And you're reminding me there of just before I finished teaching, actually, I had a third class, and a girl joined the third class who I thought was flying it with everything to do with reading and writing, until the second class teacher said, I think we need to look at assessment here. For this exact reason, I would never have any idea until you actually go and look at some screening data to see that the girl was masking. She was doing a super job at it. Paula, did you want to add anything there, or?
Yeah, I suppose this is always one that I kind of do try to highlight to practicing teachers that I might work with, is that, we have very little independent scientific evidence to support, the use of, eye exercises, vision therapy, tinted lenses, overlays, filters. Because dyslexia isn't a vision-based disorder. And I always try to say that really, really clearly. But if children feel a benefit from a coloured overlay, there's probably no harm. But it should not be the only form of support, and it's never a substitute for an evidence-informed, structured literacy programme. So that's always something that surprises people. I say, oh, well, I like writing on the yellow paper. And I say, that's absolutely fine. That preference is okay. But in terms of scientific evidence for it, we have none of that. So prioritize other effective forms of intervention there, not those vision-based eye exercises, tinted lenses, filters.
And I find it interesting every year, even just working with BEd students here in DCU, the amount of BEds who think that is good practice, until obviously we tell them that it's not. And that's very much a kind of a perception, I think, that's out there. Jen, sorry, did you want to come in again?
No, I think there's actually research, and I tried to find it and I couldn't, but there's research to say that those colored lenses actually help the general population almost as much as they do dyslexic learners. It's just a preference, it's sometimes, but it's that danger that if we tell a child, well, this is going to make things better for you, and then it doesn't, that child, that hurdle of what's supposed to work for me still isn't working, so I think, it is almost quite dangerous, to be telling a child, if you have this colored lens, this is going to fix everything for you. And some of it is just coming from, like, we want that magic bullet. We want that, this is going to work for that child and it's going to work quickly for them. And we know with the likes of dyslexia, that silver bullet just isn't out there. This is going to be a long journey for not only you as the parent or the teacher, but it's going to be a long journey for the child as well. And no amount of eye exercises or colored lenses is going to overcome that.
I might just bring in some comments there from the chat. We have a very active group of webinar participants, which is great to see this sunny evening. And there's one that's jumping out at me, not just because it's in capital letters, but because it's a hobby horse of my own, which is learning styles. This is something that we encounter again and again and again and again, not just in literacy education or working with children with dyslexia or dyslexic profile, but more generally as well. Do any of my esteemed panelists have any comment they'd like to make on the idea of learning styles and I suppose the intersection between that and dyslexia or supports for children with dyslexia?
How polite do you want us to be, Patrick?
Very polite because it's being recorded, Donald.
So I remember going to talk once and the phrase hogwash was used, which is not really a phrase you hear very often in these parts, but yeah, there's no evidence for people having a defined learning style. It is incredibly pernicious though as a concept, and people who should know a lot better continue to reference it. I'll leave it there.
Very polite, thank you, Donald. And I'm scrolling through here again. It's in anyone who hasn't opened up the chat. We won't be able to look at all of the comments, but I'd encourage you to scroll through people experiencing kind of their own, or sorry, sharing their own experiences working professionally with children with dyslexia. There's one that's actually come up there again, which might tie in with the idea of myths or not myths, which is dyslexic fonts. So, like the one that springs to mind is dyslexia. I have my own thoughts on that, but I'd be interested to hear Paula, Jen, Donald, have you anything you'd like to add on that particular one?
Yeah, so this is actually something we discuss with some of the students that I work with, and it all depends on which study you go to in terms of outcomes, and then you have to evaluate how good the study is. I would say I go back to the fact, because the evidence is so spotty, I don't know, would that be a first recommendation, a second recommendation, or a third recommendation? The evidence currently says, it's very mixed. It's all down to the study. Some people actually say it's more to do with the spacing rather than the actual font itself. So any font that has spacing between letters and words that is appropriate is probably what's there as well. So again, that's what the studies that investigate dyslexia say when compared with a font like Arial. It's not because of its specially designed letter shapes, but because of the spacing. So I suppose my comment on that would be, I don't know if we have the evidence to recommend that, particularly given the cost often associated with that. I don't know what Jen and Donald's views on that research would be.
Yeah, I'd chime in. I'd support that entirely. I remember at a few conferences, it's been raised time and time again. I think the specialist fonts are often developed by individuals with dyslexia who might have an expertise in graphic design, and it certainly seems to be what they consider would help them. Any controlled study that's looked at this has findings that you have to take with a very take them very carefully, basically. I've maybe asked Patrick to pop into the chat. Dyslexia Ireland has some guidelines on inclusive communication, where we just sort of try to give general advice about how to present information, if that is on a worksheet or a PowerPoint slide, if you're presenting that in a class. And yeah, there is some evidence about spacing between words, between lines, but the actual font seems to be limited to a nice, clean sans serif font. But if it's available electronically, then individuals can just customize it to what suits them best, a bit like we all do with our own devices. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I know it's been a few years since I looked at the research on this, but to me it was very much saying, kind of like with all of the myths or misconceptions, if there's a student who finds it helpful individually, obviously they should use it. But that when we look at the more kind of formal studies that have been done, that they don't show any benefits compared to other fonts. Now, we might move the conversation on a little bit towards assessment and screening, and we've a few questions in the chat, and it's something we plan to talk about anyway, which is around when to start thinking about assessment and what maybe we should be looking out for with younger kids. And I'm trying to find, there's so many comments in the chat, which is great to see. There's one particular question around that. I think looking around, is it around senior infants, concerns that may be starting to emerge there. So I'll hand to the panel, like what should we be looking out for and when should we be looking out for these indicators?
Donald, do you want to go ahead?
No, after you.
Okay. I suppose some of this goes back to the definition. So you'll see in the definition of dyslexia, it says that children have to have had adequate instruction in order to be diagnosed. So we have to have got to the point where the children have been taught the alphabetic principle, probably have had an intervention to support them before psychologists are happy to say, okay, a lot has been done and this child is still struggling. So that's the formal piece and the formal diagnosis. And I know, Donald, you can talk a little bit more to that. But I suppose I'd be coming from a preventative approach. And we have the knowledge of the dyslexia paradox, which is that idea that we're at the age that children are being diagnosed, it doesn't align with the time when intervention is most effective. And we know that intervention is incredibly effective the earlier we get in there. And there is so much that the teachers out there, we can use now to start identifying children who may be at risk for dyslexia. So, we may not say that a junior infant or a senior infant has dyslexia, but what we can say is, I'm concerned that this child is at risk for a future reading difficulty such as dyslexia. So all that reading research that has been done in phonological awareness, particularly phonemic awareness, this idea that if a child, at even pre-reading stage, we can start to see, is there a child who's having trouble, rhyming, doesn't hear the rhyme in words, has trouble clapping syllables, maybe even at that preschool age. So there's lots of early indicators for dyslexia. We don't have to wait until a child has been diagnosed, maybe up at second class if they're lucky, to have a diagnosis at that stage. We really need, as soon as we have any inkling that a child has a reading difficulty, and that could even be for a reason other than dyslexia. There are lots of children that kind of reading difficulties that are sort of almost that doesn't mean that they're going to go on to have dyslexia, or that they're going to be diagnosed with dyslexia, I should say. So early intervention, early prevention, looking for early indicators, and screening is really, really important. And that idea of not waiting for the child to fail in order to intervene.
Donald, did you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, sure. We actually have an assessment policy we review every couple of years. I've just popped it in the chat there again, if you don't mind.
Pass it along. Yeah, thanks, Donald.
Posting that. About 10 years ago, I think it was about 10 years ago, maybe even longer, maybe 11 or 12 years ago, we wrote a policy at Dyslexia Ireland for the educational psychologists team there, which explicitly stated that we would not be measuring IQ as part of an assessment to reflect the evidence base, unless there was a couple of caveats, unless it would shortchange the client in terms of applying for a particular resource, of which nowadays there's only two things where you would require that score, and people might know what those are. Now, that was 2013, let's say, or 2014. We knew in 1995, 96 that discrepancy model should be discontinued. There was a special issue of the Dyslexia Journal, edited by Miles, where they asked for academics to present papers to support discrepancy or to discredit discrepancy. And they got no academic papers that could support discrepancy model, despite it being then and now still the prevalent model. In fact, the editor was a bit embarrassed about this debate issue, which was no debate. It was kind of 4-0. So he then tried to mount a defence himself by looking at the research and evidence, and the actual final score was 5-0. He said, I can't actually defend this. Now, that was back in 95, 96, 30 years ago. So it sometimes is incredible how slow systems are to change, or how slow professionals are to change in their practice. But certainly our guideline, as we've put in there, we always review it every couple of years. And pivoting according to evidence is a strength, not a weakness.
Okay. Paula, did you want to come in back?
Yeah, like I do think that idea of pivoting when research makes that recommendation is really important. And again, under the new emerging evidence that, it says that we can be thinking about reading difficulties and dyslexia much earlier by focusing on, the precursors. So things like oral language, as Jen said, phonologic and phonemic awareness, memory, whether or not there's background factors such as a parent or a close family member. There is evidence that talks a lot about this idea of rapid naming and fluency. So, how quickly, when presented with a series of images, can the child name and identify them? It's a proxy for processing speed, and we can look at those things early on in the child's educational career, junior and senior infants. Um, and as we kind of move up the school then as well, that we kind of think about broader ones, more traditional ones, in terms of decoding, in terms of spelling, that idea that can an older learner, form and retrieve letters, letter sequences, what are their spelling patterns, etc. So again, it's that idea when we come to an assessment, maybe to support instruction, that we're looking at multiple sources to guide and identify a point of instruction there.
Thank you, everyone. I suppose just to maybe crystallize what we said there a little bit, if I were a teacher in senior infants right now, and I had a concern about a child in my class, correct me now if I'm summarizing you wrong. We're saying we should be screening early regardless and offering support regardless. Um, but at what point should we be moving to, okay, maybe we've documented interventions on the continuum of support and we're starting to move up through the continuum of support. At what point should we be looking to a more formal assessment? And I might go to Donald on this one.
Sure. I think the other key point there is reaching out to parents and guardians
Hmm.
as soon as you have a concern. And schools are quite slow to do that. And parents are often waiting for schools to make the first move. And for example, if you contacted a parent and said, look, we're a little bit worried about reading and spelling, it's 2 years now of school and the phonics aren't quite landing, the books coming home are taking a wee bit longer than we maybe expect, or they're being memorised, etc. And then a parent might share their concerns, or indeed a family history of dyslexia. And then all of a sudden, what is maybe a teacher thinking, well, I feel like maybe there's a small issue. All of a sudden that crystallizes into there probably is an issue here. And one rule of thumb we would give is just trying to make sure that a young person is not alone wondering and worrying about why they cannot manage what every other child around them is managing. And if you can intervene with a professional assessment and talk in an age-appropriate way to a young person that they have dyslexia and what that means, that is so much protection for their confidence and self-esteem and well-being. Just ask adults who are diagnosed late in life or late in school how much school became a toxic experience for them. And the last thing I'd say is really that, we used to talk in our course about false positives and false negatives, and we sometimes had to explain what that was because it's a slightly scientific concept. A worldwide pandemic has helped us in understanding what this is. We do not have an overdiagnosis problem when it comes to dyslexia. We do not have false positives. If we do, they're far, far outweighed still by false negatives, where people are going through 14 years of education and being missed. And there's, for every protective factor, there are young people who are working under lots of risk factors, and that might be the school they go to, the background, whether their parents are strong advocates for them. And I think the issue is that we want to make sure that we're avoiding that. If you look at the most recent adult literacy results in Ireland, I think it's roughly 1/4 of adults are underneath the functional literacy rate. Now, a lot of these, back 20 years ago, we might have explained that by the school systems and, the primitive understanding we had about dyslexia. Nowadays, it's really hard to justify or understand why such a large proportion of adult society can't read. And these are people who went to school in the 90s and the noughties, as much as people who went to school in the 60s and the 70s. And I think a major component of that is missed dyslexia.
So just to, I see, can I get some consensus on the panel here? 2 years of instruction is what's being mentioned. That's kind of end of senior infant, start of first class kind of timing. Do the three of you agree around there will be when you might start thinking about a more of a formal assessment? Okay.
Yeah, I think most senior infant teachers at
Yeah.
this stage should know there's an issue. If you said, who are the 2 or 3 kids you're worried about? Junior infants would be too early, obviously, but you wouldn't need to wait much longer. And we have, we get emails and comments on our social media saying we've been told by, again, people who should know better, that you have to wait until a child is a certain age or a certain, fifth or sixth class before someone is willing to. That is more than 3/4 of the way through your primary school education. Completely unjustifiable. And frankly, I think these figures like age or particular waiting are often plucked from thin air. If you think about a good senior infant teacher, can he or she identify an issue? Yes, and then doing something about it. And you go at a different pace according to maybe what is in front of you. But if a parent comes back and says family history of dyslexia, we are a house, indeed a generations of dyslexics. We were hoping that it might not be an issue, but actually it looks like it is. Then you could probably move with more speed and more certainty, but you certainly don't want to delay. And my own view as a psychologist is I've heard psychologists over the years start sentences with I wouldn't be comfortable, etc., etc. And I'm not worried about psychologists. I'm worried about a young person who's, drowning in a school environment without knowing why. And that should probably be the primary driver of how professionals should act, as well as obviously within the context of the evidence base.
Thanks,
And then
Donald.
just to don't wait for that diagnosis, intervene as soon as you see those issues while you're waiting on a diagnosis. There's no need to wait.
And I see there are lots of comments in the chat, lots of people helping each other out with links and suggestions, which is great to see because I can just about keep on top of the comments there while listening to the panelists at the same time. But lots of comments around the challenges in getting a formal assessment. And by the sounds of what I see there in the chat, there isn't always, and we know this, there isn't alignment between what ideally we would like and unfortunately what actually happens in schools in certain cases due to lack of resources in particular
And
cases.
it's an equity piece as well. Okay, in the UK we talk about the postcode, we could talk about the air code issue here. Yeah, if I'm a parent and I can afford to pay 500, 600, 700 euro to get my child assessed privately, if I don't have that money, I am waiting on the system, and the system is not keeping up.
And Lisa's pointing out there, Lisa has a comment that it puts teachers in a kind of difficult position in that if you're recommending assessment, but the assessment can't actually be followed through on, that is a kind of invidious position for teachers to be in, and obviously upsetting for parents who want to do the best for their children. I might pick up on another series of comments that's there in the chat, which is actually moving us up through the school system a little bit. We've talked there about the younger end. But if you're a post-primary teacher working with dyslexic learners and you're kind of dealing with timetabling challenges, and also I can see there in the chat, in some cases, quite large variation in literacy needs within a group, what's the best way to progress? So I'd be interested to hear any advice that the panelists might have for post-primary settings and supporting dyslexic learners there.
Yeah, like I'm very fortunate. I get to go into post-primary schools as part of my role here in DCU. And I would agree it's very, very challenging for a number of reasons. Oftentimes in a primary context, there's more flexibility in terms of the size of the group or even the ability to give one-to-one support. When you move into post-primary, it tends to be very large groups due to the sheer timetabling kind of wizardry that has to go on to get everyone through the day. I think one of the key things to do is to think about how can you support the learners to develop their reading skills in a way that acknowledges their age as well. So can you scaffold them appropriately to engage with texts? So are you going to give them guidance on text structure? Are you going to maybe ensure that over the course of a fortnight that you work with related texts? So your focus is on World War II, you talk about Germany, etc. that do you give them specific vocabulary instruction where you might draw on things like the roots of words, morphology, etymology? Do you give them guidance on syntax? And again, if they do need access to decoding skills, that you have evidence to justify, well, where are they on a particular sequence or a scope and sequence, and give one-to-one there where appropriate. But it is important to acknowledge that it is much more difficult in post-primary context because of the groups that they're working with. There, and sometimes within an hour-long class, I would see really effective teaching where they'll do something as a whole group, and then there might be some maybe 2 or 3 people or one-to-one, like using assistive technology, doing Lexia or something along those lines. But it is certainly more challenging in a post-primary context, I think.
Donald,
I would agree. I think it is a challenge there, and I think the biggest, it's a truism, but instead of learning to read, you're often reading to learn in a post-primary context. So I think the focus, by and large, has to be more on making learning and teaching accessible and thinking about using technology as much as possible in order to do that. That would be a major plank of anything in terms of facilitating access to the curriculum.
Okay. Jen, do you want to come in, or are you happy with what we said there?
Yeah, no, that assistive technology piece is so important for them to access what they need to access, but then obviously giving them support where possible. But I think the first point is making sure they have that assistive technology to aid them and support them.
Okay.
Could I just a quick clarification, it comes under myths as well, I suppose, a little bit. There is a grant, financial support to help people access buying technology, and it's a bit of there's a lot of confusion around that, and it's not very well managed at the moment, but the whole system around that is being reviewed. But that's about access to finance to buy a piece of kit. The permission to use technology, there is no criteria, there is no circular. That just is expected that schools can and should support children in line with that need to make reasonable adjustments. So there's sometimes busy schools and busy teachers sometimes are under the impression that you need to have a score at this percentile, or you need an IQ score, or it needs to be this circular. That's just if a family or a school do not have access to a piece of kit. So just to emphasise that, sometimes there's some misunderstanding around that.
Okay.
Thanks, I might just come in on one aspect that I find I often get asked about is that there's a program called RACE. So for primary colleagues that might not be aware, this is called reasonable accommodations for certified examinations. So to use assistive technology or anything like that at post-primary for junior cycle or senior cycle. And unfortunately, those decisions actually come in really, really late within the year of it, which is very, very frustrating. And I suppose what I always recommend, because I would have teachers say, well, I don't want to give them assistive technology because I can't guarantee it'll be there in the end. And I totally understand that. But what teachers who work in post-primary often tell me said, well, if we start using this as soon as possible and we get evidence of the learners using assistive technology and then the difficulties that they experience in classes and school exams when they don't get to use it, they build up that evidence that little bit sooner rather than waiting until, and then they've lots of evidence for it. It doesn't guarantee, but certainly I think it is, based on the teachers I work with, they often recommend it. And one teacher now who I always go to when I want guidance on what the current thinking is on reasonable accommodations, because they do change a lot. The timelines are exceptionally poor, particularly for learners who want to know if they'll have access by the end, is that if they're able to say somewhere that they've explicitly taught them important skills in using word processors and file management. And I know some people might be really surprised by that, but people who do work maybe at a third level would be aware that oftentimes we do have to teach that ourselves, but this is how the Google Drive works, etc. But again, from a post-primary context, it is very, very, it is, that particular aspect is very frustrating because it doesn't actually match up with best practice. But I would recommend Dyslexia Ireland's tools and recommendations and ideas and videos on Dyslexia Ireland.
And I think Donald posted something in. I just reposted it there into the chat for everyone. Donald, did you want to add anything
Yeah,
on
they're
that?
just really short videos about how to use things like speech to text and text to speech in everyday common devices or software like Microsoft 365, Google Docs, Android, iPhones, that sort of stuff. Paul has made some really good points there. There is that mismatch with RACE, the accommodation scheme, and that scheme is currently being reviewed by the State Examinations Commission, and they have committed to looking at how assistive technology is used. At the moment, it is very challenging for schools and for young people if they're not sure that the way they normally learn is going to be permissible in an exam situation. And the irony is we've got entire schools or groups of schools now using technology day in, day out, and then that's taken away from them on the day of, or the most important week of the year. So that has to change with this review. It's inconceivable that we continue to ignore the fact that teaching and learning has moved on, so assessment needs to match it.
I think as well, Donald, it's worth highlighting the extra time for examinations. The fact that dyslexic children get no extra time at the state exams, and I know Dyslexia Ireland are campaigning against that. Yet at third level, our students do get extra time in accommodation, so it just beggars belief why that isn't happening at post-primary level when it's happening at third level. It just worth highlighting.
Thank you, Jen. I'm just monitoring the chat there. I know there's a lot of commentary on kind of standards for assessment and who's enabled to conduct assessments in Ireland. So I'd encourage people to have a look there at the chat for the commentary if you haven't. I'm going to move us on another little bit because the time is flying. It's 10 to 8 already. And I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about practice. So we've talked about dyslexia, what it is, myths, misconceptions, a little about when we might assess and things to look out for, and maybe some of the challenges that are encountered in the system presently on that front. But what next? So if we have a child in our classroom, be it at primary or post-primary, what's the kind of headline advice that you all have for supporting them to achieve their full potential?
If we look at, I suppose, if we're working in Ireland or under the continuum of support, so we have our classroom support at that bottom tier, and I'm going to call it tier 1 for the classroom, tier 2, tier 3, because just the language is a little bit wordy in the continuum of support. But I suppose it's that idea that intervention there we go. Thanks, Patrick. Intervention begins at support for all level. Like that's where intervention, if we have high quality evidence-based teaching going on, particularly in those skills that a dyslexic child will need, like decoding, word recognition skills, what we need to make sure is that's happening at a whole class level, first of all. And then if there are children, and there always are, that need additional support, and sometimes another little myth, that tier 1 or whole class support doesn't mean that you can't have small groups and differentiation within that whole class setting. So that's happening within that. But then what we want is, obviously some children are going to need a little bit more support. Now, something that I suppose it's not happening as much as it used to, but that idea that if a child needs extra support, they come out of the class during English time. And they're given separate teaching to the rest of the class. And that's really not what we're looking for. These particular children need sort of a double whammy of what the whole class are getting. So they need to be getting that whole class literacy instruction and then getting that more intensive support at that sort of tier 2 small group, more intensive level. And I have a quote where, I don't know what I did with it. Oh, yeah, it's actually Al-Atabia. I'm going to say that wrong. Does anyone know, how do I pronounce that properly? Patrick? No. Okay. So the idea with the tier 2 support, and she just sums it up really nicely, we are going to increase the intensity by decreasing the group size, increasing the dosage, and increasing the duration. And that's what we're looking for these particular children, making sure that they're getting those evidence-based skills that they're going to need, all in that sort of decoding, fluency, accuracy, alphabetic principle, phonological awareness, again, depending on the age of the child and where they are within the school. And making sure that they're getting that in addition to the classroom instruction. And then the final point I'll make is just to try and make sure that that intervention mirrors what's happening in the class. So another thing we don't necessarily want is I'm working with one program, you know, at a whole class level, and then a child is taken out and I've introduced a completely different program that maybe uses completely different terminology and language. And if I'm a child who's already struggling, you know, what I don't need is to go back into the class and then try to piece together a program that has been introduced at intervention tier 2 level that doesn't mirror what's happening at the classroom instruction level. So
Thanks, Jen. Anyone else wants to chip in there? So practice, what are the core ingredients that need to be there to make sure dyslexic learners are properly supported?
Could I just chip in a little bit? We are every time we do either one of our training courses or a webinar like this, it is absolute guarantee that someone will ask, what do you think of this program? Or what is the program or the best program, or what would you recommend? Or we were told this by somebody and what do you think of it? Or this was recommended in a report, but it's not what we're using. So that is very understandable. And so what Dyslexia Ireland did last year was we convened a working group of experts in Ireland around dyslexia and literacy interventions. Jennifer was one of them. Thank you for your time again, Jen, with that stuff. And we sat down and said, well, look, the research on this isn't brilliant. So comparing intervention A versus intervention B in a controlled study that is replicated by other researchers over time, really the research isn't there. However, what we do know from the body of science of reading and academic research over the last decades is the core ingredients of a good literacy programme for someone with dyslexia. So what we have produced is some guidance, and I'll pop it into the chat to Patrick to post on there. I think it was referred to earlier by one of the commentators. We produced some guidance called What to Look For, and basically we have 10 questions or 10 things to look for that a good literacy intervention must have, 4 things that would be nice to have, and 3 red flags, stuff to avoid. The challenge is that when you look at maybe what is happening in your school or what has been recommended for your son or daughter, is there's a mismatch between what we are suggesting and recommending and what traditionally has been done. And we are understanding and empathetic towards that, because we need to change practice and we need to not shout at each other if you've been doing something that maybe isn't optimal over the last few years. They're not called the reading wars for nothing, and that sort of discussion about what is optimal and what isn't, what is research based and what isn't, has gone on for many years and continues now. However, if you're a parent of a dyslexic child, you don't have any patience for that stuff. You want optimal interventions straight away. So we do have a responsibility to be big grown-ups about this and say, well, we need to try and shift quite quickly. And it's not about revolutionizing what's happening in schools. It's about tweaking what approaches we take, what resources we use, and certainly not purchasing more of the same because that's what we've always done. And again, that ability to pivot and change our practice, for me in a professional as a sign, or in a school, is a sign of fantastic strength, and with kids and young people with dyslexia at the absolute centre of what they're doing and why they're doing. But it doesn't come easy, and we certainly should be respectful as people are going through that change process.
And I popped that link into the chat there, what to look for when selecting interventions for dyslexic learners. Donald, Paula, did you want to add anything on the instruction?
Yeah, I just reiterate what Don said about the Dyslexia Ireland guidance on effective interventions. And it's really important to remember that there's huge, because dyslexia is so, multifaceted, it means that dyslexic learners will vary in their needs. So of course, a one-size-fits-all approach probably won't work, and then that's influenced by age, etc. So the principles that Dyslexia Ireland are recommending are where we do need to go and say, well, what does this learner need at this time? What's the point of instruction? And again, I'm conscious that, we talked a little bit about the post-primary kind of sphere as well. And, there would be some resources aligned with the Dyslexia Ireland guidelines that go into a bit more depth about ideas for older learners that you may also need to take into account given the demands, the curricular demands that they're working through. And that would be this idea of structured literacy. That's there. I have a couple of things I have a couple of links that could be bought in. There's a lovely kind of International Dyslexia Association did a lovely 75th anniversary there that I find is a really good primer for people who want to investigate this for learners that they might be at the very young engaging with literacy difficulties and very much older as well.
Thanks, Paula.
Patrick, can I just
Yeah.
mention one other piece as well? So very often we're looking for the program, or we're looking for, and alongside the evidence-based skills, we also have to have the evidence-based methodologies. So I might have the best program in the world, but unless I'm delivering it very explicitly, very intensively, very systematically, and maybe incorporating a little bit of that multisensory piece in there as well, so it's also how we teach as well as what we teach is equally as important as well.
After you, Paula.
We did so well until now, not to talk over each other. We did so well. I would 100% agree with what Jen said. And within the kind of that structured literacy guidance, in the middle part of the wheel, it talks about the different elements of effective literacy instruction that Dyslexia Ireland speaks about in their updated guidance. But it does talk about the middle part, making sure it's that it's cumulative, systematic. All those parts are there and totally in line with what Jen said.
I just add one extra thing. I think that the right thing done in the right way is absolutely critical. The key area I think we sometimes fall down on, and this is to do with busy schools as much as anything else, and maybe teacher shortages as well, is that dosage, that intensivity. We need to do something short bursts, fast, fun, and frequent as much as possible every single day. That's how brains learn, and that's particularly how dyslexic brains learn. Once a week for an hour doesn't help me with learning my modern foreign language, which I do on my Duolingo. My Duolingo is hassling me because it's saying you haven't done your practice today, in the same way that my piano teacher used to get annoyed, or my physio currently gets annoyed because I'm not doing my regular fast, fun and frequent stuff. And that's difficult where, SET teachers are being drawn into classrooms, or you can't replace people, especially in urban areas. But it's the one thing I think that the science is absolutely clear on, that distributed practice is absolutely vital if we're going to sort of make optimal progress.
Thank you, Donald. Now we're coming up on 1 hour. There are a lot of questions and comments that we just haven't been able to get to. I've tried to tie some of them together. I know lots of the questions there are around programs that would be recommended, and I think in line with what the panelists have said, a very good starting point there is Dyslexia Ireland's guidance that we've linked around what to look out for in interventions. Just maybe to wrap up, I might ask Paula, Jen, Donald, if there's one thing that you felt any teacher or parent should know about dyslexia. I didn't prime you with this question. One thing, it can be a very long sentence with multiple subclauses if you like, but what would that one thing be that you feel people should know, given we're taking a closer look at dyslexia this evening?
Okay, I'll go first in case anybody says what I have in my head. So it's neurobiological, it's language-based, and it's common.
Thanks, Jen. And I see people are chipping in their own thoughts there. Trina says, act now, don't wait. So I'll be interested to see what our attendees are thinking too. Donald, did you have your one thing ready?
So I used to be like an EP psychologist when I worked in Scotland, and I was busy, and it was behaviour, and it was, you'd walk into school and you'd say, you're almost never here, please help us with the most challenging kid in the school. And you never got really near dyslexia often. What really transferred my understanding when I moved to Ireland and started working for this crowd, wherever the thing is I spoke to lots of people with dyslexia, and I spoke about their experiences of school. And that could be young people, or it could be college students, or it could be people in their 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s. And understanding that lived experience is fundamental in having the empathy and understanding that underpins everything else we've talked about tonight.
Thanks, Donald.
I think for me, the main thing that I have learned, and going back to what Donald said earlier about, fast, fun, and frequent, is this idea that good literacy instruction helps everybody. So if you start from that basis that everyone gets access to good literacy instruction, and when someone isn't responding to that good literacy instruction, you move in fast and you increase that dosage, you increase that intensity. But the idea of maybe focusing on tier 1 instruction so that everyone has equitable access to effective literacy instruction. And then when you need to, you act fast and increase the intensity or dosage there.
Thank you, Paula. And again, I'd encourage our participants to have a look in the chat. There's lots of other people tipping in what their one thing is, much of it relating to teacher knowledge and I think the role of a teacher, and also picking up on what you said, listening to the students, the children, the young people that we're working with and learning from them also. To wrap up this, what I've thoroughly enjoyed the last hour. I'm hoping that many of our participants have as well. I just want to draw your attention again to the Literacy Association of Ireland. That's our website there on the screen. A recording of this webinar will be made available to our members on the portal. If you don't already follow us on social media, maybe you already follow Dyslexia Ireland, keep following them, but maybe also follow the Literacy Association of Ireland. We'd love to see you connecting with us over the next while. I want to thank again Aideen in Navan Education Centre, but thank in particular on behalf of the LAI, Paula, Jen and Donald, who have so expertly shared their advice and their expertise with us over the last hour. We had enough fodder in the comments there, definitely, to keep going for another 2 or 3 hours. So maybe we'll have to reconvene again. But for this evening, thank you guys. I'm very grateful for your participation, and thank you to all the participants who joined in also.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you.